Welcome to Confronting History, the legacy of Alexander von Humboldt's encounter with the Americas in the 21st century. My name is Lucius Lichte. I'm the science advisor at the German Consulate in Boston, and it is my honor to moderate today's lunchtime discussion. We have two renowned speakers waiting for us who will contextualize Alexander von Humboldt while drawing on overarching topics like colonialism, imperialism, as well as slavery and their afterlives. Throughout the event, we encourage active participation from the audience. At any time, you can send us your questions via the Q&A function. And now we will start with brief introductory remarks. It is my great pleasure to pass the word to Nicole Menzenbach, Consul General of Germany to New England.
Hello and welcome to our discussion about Alexander von Humboldt, his encounters with the Americas and his legacies. Among historians and scientists, Alexander von Humboldt is one of the most famous Germans. He was an important figure of European Enlightenment, a brilliant naturalist and explorer. In today's time, political and historical debates are highly emotionalized. Too often, it is the loudest voice that we hear and not necessarily the voice of reason. Our society benefits from asking honest and open-ended questions when looking at historical figures and so-called national heroes. Today, we want to do just that. We want to ask questions like, are our perceptions of Humboldt shaped by one-sided narratives? Is Humboldt and his work still relevant today? To help us tackle these questions, we are being joined by Sandra Rebok and Professor Manisha Sinha. I would like to thank both of them for the valuable contribution to this conversation. I would like also to thank our partners and good friends at UConn for their commitment and dedication to the German-American friendship and for joining efforts to organize this talk. And to the audience, I hope you enjoy the discussions and I encourage you to participate and ask questions. And now it's my great pleasure to pass the word to Ngozi Taffe, Assistant Vice President of UConn. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Consul General Menzenbach, for insightful remarks and for the introduction. And a big thank you to Lucius for bringing the idea of this wonderful event to us at UConn. We obviously value your partnership and also our partnership with the German Consulate in Boston. Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to have you join us for this virtual session on Confronting History, the legacy of Alexander von Humboldt's encounter with the Americas in the 21st century. We at UConn are very proud of our relationship with Germany, which was developed through the consulate, and our over 30-year relationship with our state of Connecticut and Baden-Württemberg. In addition, we continue to enjoy our relationship with a multitude of German partners, collaborators in higher education and the private sector. We also acknowledge that the rich history of ingenuity, innovation, and critical inquiry of Germany's leading institution has greatly contributed to the strength of our country and the prosperity of the world. Programs such as student exchange, faculty mobility, research collaborations have flourished on both sides as both sides continue to affirm a longstanding and successful commitment to the value of intellectual freedom, educational excellence, international cooperation in such fields as technology, business, law, and human rights. What's more, our relationship with the German consulate, the Baden-Württemberg Ministry of Science, Research, Arts, and our German partners goes beyond professional and research collaborations. It's truly a friendship and one that we're truly grateful for. Now, as we begin this event, I want to briefly reflect on the title selected for this discussion, Confronting History. The word confronting implies difficulty and challenge in an ongoing sense, to stand in front of and to face. Certainly in the United States, as in Germany, we are living in a time in which it is no longer possible to not face the numerous crises and emergencies that far exceed anything we would characterize as merely difficult. We are still living through a pandemic that has exposed the grievous inequalities in our national and global public health systems. We are simultaneously living through a public and moral awakening that Reverend Dr. William Barber II, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, has termed as the Third Reconstruction, a confrontation with racism, police brutality, authoritarian politics, modern imperialism, and the struggle for the rights and self-determination of indigenous peoples. This ongoing work of historians such as those on this panel and their ability to interpret and reorient our understanding of these iconic figures is crucial at this pivotal moment in our history. Who better to lead today's discussion than Dr. Sandra Rebok and Professor Manisha Sinha, who make vital contributions to our understanding and reassessment of history in their current research. With that said, I'd like to turn it back to Lucius to continue this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you to both of you for your kind words. And now without any further ado, I would like to introduce our stars for today. We are joined by Dr. Sandra Rebok. She is a German historian of knowledge whose research focuses on exploration voyages, the globalization of science and intellectual networks during the 19th century. She draws on more than 25 years of experience in Humboldt research, and she's the author of several books on Humboldt. Among them, one that discusses the intellectual exchange with Thomas Jefferson, and her forthcoming monograph that analyzes his position between the Spanish Empire and the expanding United States. In 2019, on the occasion of Alexander von Humboldt's 250th anniversary, she carried out a large research project on Humboldt's perceptions in Latin America on behalf of the German Foreign Ministry and the German Institute of Foreign Relations. Sandra is joined by Professor Manisha Sinha. Manisha is the Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut, a historian of the long 19th century. Her research interests lie specifically in the transnational histories of slavery, abolition, and feminism, and the history and legacy of the Civil War and Reconstruction. She is the author of numerous books and articles, including The Counter-Revolution of Slavery, Politics and Ideology in Antebellum South Carolina, which was featured in the New York Times 1619 project, and the multiple award-winning The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition, which was long listed for the National Book Award for Nonfiction. And now I would like to pass the word to the first presentation. Sandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. Welcome to everyone. I would like to start my presentation thanking the University of Connecticut and the German General Consulate in Boston for organizing this joint event, and in particular Lucius Lichte for his effort and persistence in this process, which has been a long process because we actually started before the pandemic to discuss about this possibility. So when we started discussing about the idea came up to discuss Humboldt in the context of the current debates on colonialism, imperialism, and slavery, I was very much in favor, since these are indeed important topics and there's much confusion on how Humboldt should be situated in them. It is important to shed light on specific points that help us to understand him better in his historic context, because this is what I consider important. We should not look at events, developments, or persons in the past from our perspective today and the values of our modern times, but contextualize them in their historic setting. Before we start contextualizing Humboldt in his setting, let's have a brief look first at the question, who was Alexander von Humboldt? Alexander von Humboldt was born in 1769 into a prominent and wealthy family settled in Berlin and with close ties to the Prussian court. His father was a major in the Prussian army and royal chamberlain. His mother came from a Huguenot family, so these were French Protestants who emigrated to Prussia. Young Alexander spent most of his childhood at the family's estate at Schloss Tegel together with his older brother, Wilhelm, who would later become a celebrated linguist, philosopher, and diplomat. Humboldt grew up in the era of colonial expansion and extensive exploration voyages carried out by famous explorers such as Louis Antoine de Bougainville, James Cook, or Alessandro Malaspina. The adventurous descriptions of these journeys fascinated him from his early youth, and he informed his longings for undertaking himself such an exploration voyage through the exotic world. After several failed attempts to form part of such an exploration voyage himself, at the age of 30, he was able to initiate a 5-year expedition in Spanish America, along with his French colleague Aimé Bonpland. So it was in a different way than what he had initially contemplated. It was an expedition aimed to the advancement of the sciences, aimed to the study of nature in all its facets. Yet in many ways, it was exceptional and different to other endeavors of his time. Most important is because he carried this expedition out with a very generous passport or permission authorization from the Spanish crown under circumstances that normally explorers would not attain. Yet, and this is very important, he covered all the costs himself. His American expedition, carried out from 1799 to 1804, laid the fundament for Humboldt's later fame and provided him with an outstanding opportunity to develop what we call today Humboldtian science. This is a global and holistic understanding of the sciences, connecting constantly information from different fields of knowledge and different geographic areas. It's a very collaborative science for which he built his impressive international networks of knowledge. After his return to Europe in 1804, he dedicated over 5 decades to the elaboration of the results of his work. He did that for the first 23 years in Paris, and then later he moved back to Prussia. However, while his fame as scholar continuously grew, it was the historical and political context in which he carried out his science what has generated criticism from different angles. And here I don't only refer to the Spanish exploration voyage, but in general. So Humboldt has been called a colonial explorer at the service of the Spanish crown, a spy for the young United States. This was because he passed information to Thomas Jefferson. He also was called the leader of the independence movement in Spanish America and a defender of the manifest destiny in the United States. So this obviously needs clarification because these ascriptions are not only based on incorrect interpretations, they are even contradictory. So when Humboldt took the decision to undertake his voyage overseas, he was well aware that he would encounter a colonial reality that would be far from his enlightened values. As excited as he was about the tropical vegetation and the exotic world at his arrival in Cumaná, which today is Venezuela, where he started his first extra-European experience, it was also here where he had his first encounter with colonialism and with the institution of slavery. So if we are interested in getting his first impressions on that, then a wonderful source for that are his diaries, so his personal annotations. I'm going to summarize a little text that we can find in there. It's a text or a little essay on the institution of colonialism, found in his travel diaries, and this reveals his position. Here, Humboldt condemns the very basic concept of colonialism, the idea, as he says, that one country should pay tribute to another, and that the expansion of prosperity, industry, as well as latent ideas remained under the control of that dominating country. According to Humboldt, a colonial government was a government of mistrust, one under which authority was not distributed for the sake of the happiness of the inhabitants, but according to the interests of the metropolis. And this, I'm summarizing, paraphrasing Humboldt, this resulted in a lack of morality and in an uneasiness that could be felt in these regions by visitors who were sensitive to these issues. He clearly included himself in that. So this private document demonstrates that his personal convictions were based on strong moral considerations and that the well-being and the happiness of the people was always foremost in his mind. If we look for these comments in his publications, we find them so much less because here he also had to be cautious. Nevertheless, it is Yeah. So what I also find very interesting in this in this text in particular, but also in general, is the depth of his analysis. So he does not just condemn what he sees, but he also analyzes it in a very knowledgeable way. So he talks about the causes and the consequences and the impact of the colonial society or colonial administration on society. And nevertheless, what is important to note is that his sharp criticism not only refers to the Spanish possessions he visited, but also to the colonial system established by European nations in general. Now I quote him, he says, "Nowhere should a European feel more ashamed than on the islands, regardless of whether he is French, English, Danish, or Spanish," he stated. Moreover, to debate which nation, I quote, "needs the Negroes," that's the word he used, "with more humanity is to mock the word humanity." So I think this quote summarizes well his opinion. So talking about slavery, he called slavery the greatest evil that ever afflicted humanity. In many different occasions, he says he refers to the despicable system of slavery, etc. He also he clearly believed in the unity of human species, as he says in his latest work, Cosmos, in his final and synthesizing work. So he believed in the unity of human species, and he repelled what he called the depressing assumption of superior and inferior races of man. All, according to him, are equally destined for freedom. However, what we also need to know is that he was not the, let's say, outspoken or early outspoken abolitionist in Spanish America or in the United States, as we would like to see him. So he was not, especially during his time in Cuba, he was not only had close contacts with slaveholders, but he was also a guest in their house. So he was, for example, for 5 months, he was a guest at the house of Juan Luis de la Cuesta, and Cuesta was the most important slave trader in Cuba in his times. So Humboldt was closely immersed in this context, something that some people criticize. You can also see it from a different angle. This allowed him to be really in close contact with this system and be able to analyze it well. And this is what he did later. So over time, he really developed a strong discourse against slavery and made that clear whenever he had the possibility. But I think that we are going to talk about this aspect in particular in a moment. So summarizing, Humboldt was certainly not a colonial explorer or someone who accepted social injustice. Yet he was criticized for carrying out his science in a colonial context, for using the colonial infrastructure during his exploration voyage, or for allowing his science being used for strategic purposes, or sometimes even for being not more outspoken or for not criticizing more the circumstances at that moment. However, I think that this criticism does not do him justice. At this point, I believe we need to be realistic. For Humboldt, the question was not under which circumstances he wished to carry out his expedition, but how to be able to develop his scientific project under the given circumstances. As much as the appropriation of the world by European powers can be criticized from our perspective, this was the context of Humboldt's time. So he needed an authorization in order to travel and enter extra-European territories. You could not just travel there without any authorization. And Prussia at that moment did not have any overseas possession. So Humboldt had to deal with other political powers in London, Paris, or Madrid. And this is what he did until things worked out with the Spanish Empire. Traveling in those areas, of course, meant using the existing infrastructure, and that this was set up for strategic and commercial purposes. It also meant facilitating information to the authorities in exchange for information that he received. Yet, what we have to recall is it was a self-financed expedition. Humboldt kept full control over the content and the itinerary, the contact, the work, etc. During his American expedition. And most importantly, he kept full control over the fruits of his work, and this was key for him. So Humboldt has been much criticized for carrying out his exploration voyage in the context of the Spanish Empire. His arrangements with Spain provided him with a maximum of liberty that he could possibly get. In comparison, we just have to look at the second big exploration voyage that he carried out. This was in 1829 when he traveled through Russia from St. Petersburg to the Chinese border. These were totally different circumstances. It was not a colonial system, but an imperial context. Humboldt was aware of it. So he had to face problems and needed to make concessions in order to be able to expand the regional scope of his work. And this is what he wanted to do. He didn't want to look only at America, but also at Asia. So what I'm trying to show with this little glimpses in such a broad topic is that the reality is rather complex and should not be overly simplified. We need a differentiated approach to Humboldt. We should not create a untouchable hero narrative, nor should we have a overly critical approach that evaluates Humboldt or any other historic person on based on our values and based on our limited understanding of the context. So instead of a judgment of the past, we should try to understand the historical context, because this gives us the possibility to derive lessons from history that might be useful for our time. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra, for that. And I want to also thank Consul General Menzenbach and Vice President Taffe for hosting us today. I think this is a fascinating topic. And as Sandra has already given you an introduction into Alexander von Humboldt, an expert introduction, I see my job more as a historian of slavery and abolition, and to sort of place his views in the broader history of abolition. I came across Alexander von Humboldt. Of course, we've all heard of him, the great man of the Enlightenment. He's seen also as one of the last Renaissance men, a man of many parts, somewhat self-educated, but also at some of the famous universities in Germany at that time. A student of Blumenbach, somebody who knew Goethe. He's very much epitomized the strands of German Enlightenment. The Enlightenment itself, of course, was a mixed bag for those who were enslaved in the Western world. On the one hand, ideas about humanity and universal rights was really inspirational for many early abolitionists and anti-slavery thinkers, both Black and white, in the Atlantic world. On the other hand, the emphasis on rationality, on a certain valuation of literate cultures, a certain idea of the science of man, that place humanity in a differentiated and sometimes in more cruder senses in a sort of a graduated scale, could lead, pro-slavery thinkers to use those ideas to justify slavery. Now, where does Humboldt fall in all of this? As Sandra put it, Humboldt was not an abolitionist. He saw himself as a man of science, as a naturalist. In fact, I read a wonderful book on him, The Invention of Nature, by Andrea Wolf, that tells us that he was a man for all seasons, that we could today, even modern day environmentalists, go back and read Humboldt and learn something from him. But as far as the history of abolition was concerned, I kept coming across Humboldt. I came across him in the papers of British abolitionists who wanted him to come on board with them and join their crusade against the slave trade. They wanted all the European powers, including Prussia. This is, of course, before German unification in 1870. They wanted all these continental powers to come on board to stop the slave trade from Africa to the New World. Now, I don't know if Humboldt ever responded to them, but I do know that he was more concerned with his travels and with his cataloging of this natural world, and being actually one of the first people to look at man-made destruction by European colonization of this world, the Americas. I did come across other German abolitionists who are not often talked about. And I want to draw your attention to them because most Germans, I found, also were not aware of this. So on the very eve of the British movement against the African slave trade and the rise of what we call the first wave of anti-slavery in the United States, gradual emancipation in most of the northern states that eventually made a country that was half slave and half free. At that very time, the famous German philosopher Johann Gottfried Herder criticized slavery and European colonialism in his seminal Ideas for a Philosophy of the History of Mankind. In fact, to Herder, as much as British Quakers, who kind of led the Anglo-American abolition movement, we can attribute the famous abolitionist slogan, "Am I not a man and a brother?" For Herder had asked, "Is the African not a man and your brother?" Now, no doubt, Herder, like Quaker abolitionists, was influenced by the New Testament and the biblical quotation from Cain, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Now, Herder's evocation of humanitate, that's something that, of course, Humboldt also evokes humanity, which he got from Diderot, from the French Revolution, and Humboldt too is very influenced by the French philosophes. Those ideas allowed Herder to develop a trenchant critique of European colonialism, which he described in his poem on Christopher Columbus as a crime against humanity by, quote, "the white race." And nearer home, he criticized the German princes who were complicit in the African slave trade. Now, while Herder, like many European thinkers of his age, promoted certain connections between climate and race that also led to ideas of racial difference, he was a severe critic of slavery. In his remarkable cycle of poems, which he ironically entitled Neger Idealen, Herder reversed the symbolism of black and white, good and evil, writing, quote, "Der Neger malt den Teufel weiß." The black man paints the devil white, and referring, quote, to the noble black man and his master as, quote, a white devil. Also reversing the empty morality of Christianization and colonization, Herder tells the tale of a dying African slave. Quote, "Warum," and apologies for my German pronunciation, "Warum gießest du mir Wasser auf den Kopf?" sagt jener sterbende Sklav zum Missionar. "Ich mag keinen Himmel, wo Weiße sind," sprach kehrte das Gesicht ab und starb. So Herder wrote many of these poems, and I also found that he wrote a poem called Der Geburtstag, which celebrated an American abolitionist, Warner Mifflin, a Quaker from Delaware, who actually led a one-man lobby in the United States Congress, trying Congress to restrict the slave trade, the domestic slave trade, and also abolish slavery. Not until the radical German Jewish poet Heinrich Heine would publish Das Sklavenschiff, the slave ship, in 1853, would any German write such overtly abolitionist poems. Now, Heine's poems also should be remembered. His satirical poem is often overlooked, but it was comparable to those written by British and American abolitionist poets whom we know about, William Cowper, John Greenleaf Whittier. In his poem, Heine delivers a searing critique of European greed, religious hypocrisy, and racism, illustrated by a rapacious Atlantic slave trade. And this is a quote from his poem. "The supercargo Mynheer van Cook is sitting and calculating. There in his cabin, he reckons the worth and profits to come from his freighting. The rubber is good, the pepper is good. At 300 barrels, we'll set her. I've got gold dust here and ivory. The black commodities better. In Jesus' name, have mercy, Lord, on the lives of this sinful black chattel. If they engage thee, don't forget, they're as dumb as cattle. So again, ideas of racial inferiority to justify slavery, something that Humboldt was very uncomfortable with. So again, Humboldt was not an abolitionist, but he clearly entertained a lot of anti-slavery ideas. And this came to a head a little bit in the 1840s with the rise of anti-slavery free soil politics in the United States, when Northerners started demanding, especially after the Mexican War had led to the ceding of a vast amount of territory in the Southwest to the United States. Northerners had started demanding that slavery should not expand to these areas. And Southerners, in fact, demanded as a price of their union that slavery should expand and remain in perpetuity in the United States. This is where we see Humboldt intervening and developing some, clearly ideas about politics in the United States. He calls the United States' attempts to annex territory from Mexico and Cuba, quote, savage. He praised the Latin American, the Spanish American republics for having actually abolished slavery or tried to in a gradual fashion once they had achieved independence. This is also the time when the German 1848ers, refugees from the 1848 revolutions, the failed revolutions in the German states, had started coming into the United States. Many of them were radicals. A lot of them became abolitionists. Many of them actually fought for the Union in the Civil War, even rising to command armies of the Union. And this is when African Americans and abolitionists started looking at German Americans as allies. There were anti-abolitionist mobs at this time. Many of the German American gymnasiums, the Turnvereins, would actually help African Americans and abolitionists in self-defense. So German Americans were getting a reputation, whether they deserved it or not. They were prominent 1848ers who had allied with the abolitionist movement. And these were the men who started evoking Humboldt as an anti-slavery hero. When there was the rise of nativism, anti-immigrant feeling, especially against German and Irish immigrants, the German radical journalist Karl Heinzen, who was right here, based in Boston, he published a German language newspaper called Die Pioneer. He actually approached the abolitionists and he said, if the nativists get their way, you wouldn't allow a man of such intellectual majesty as Humboldt into this country just because he was German. So his name is being used. But Humboldt himself becomes involved directly in anti-slavery politics in the United States, something that a lot of people don't know much about. But the late leftist historian Philip Foner discovered this. And I found this out when I was writing my book on abolition, The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition. He got involved in a controversy because there was a pro-slavery Southerner by the name of John S. Thrasher who translated Humboldt's work on Cuba into English in 1856. It was called The Island of Cuba. And what this pro-slavery man did was he removed all of Humboldt's criticisms of slavery in the English translation. And he did this because at this time, Southern slaveholders were dreaming of a slaveholding empire in Central America. They were leading illegal invasions of Nicaragua, of Cuba. They wanted to annex this into a vast pro-slavery empire, part of the scheme to make slavery a permanent aspect of the American Republic and for it to live on in perpetuity. And this gave rise to opposition in the North, eventually to the rise of the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, not to be confused with the modern Republican Party. This was the party of racial liberalism. It was the party of Lincoln, the party of big government. At that time, the Democratic Party was the party of, increasingly in the 1850s, of Southern slaveholders and white supremacy in the North, a conservative party, a party of states' rights. So Humboldt gets involved a little bit in this. it comes to his attention that his remarks on slavery, and Sandra did a wonderful job in delineating those remarks. They were a pretty strong condemnation of slavery, even though he was not an active abolitionist. And he is rather angry about this. But as a man of the Enlightenment, sort of expresses his dismay in a very temperate manner. He says, quote, as a steady advocate as I am of the most unfettered expression of opinion in speech or in writing, I should never have thought of complaining if I had been attacked on account of my statements. But I do think I'm entitled to demand that in the free states of the continent of America, people should be allowed to read what has been permitted to circulate from the first year of its appearance in the Spanish translation. So he is angry that his anti-slavery remarks have been removed. And the author, I should say the translator of his work, this pro-slavery Southerner, John Thrasher, wrote a letter to the New York Times saying, oh, I just wanted to lay out information about Cuba to American readers. It's a very lame explanation. And of course, the Consul General and the consulate in Boston will be interested to hear that the letter caught the eye of the Prussian minister in the United States, von Gerold, and he sent Humboldt a copy of Thrasher's letter, and he called it correctly, quote, very weak. As the Cuban historian noted many years later, quote, the mutilations of Humboldt's text are not slight or insignificant. In fact, he had removed an entire chapter called On Slavery from his text. And von Gerold further noted to Humboldt that, this controversy had become a big controversy in the United States and, quote, has stirred great emotions everywhere here and was very welcome to the forces which have chosen Fremont as their candidate. Now, John C. Fremont was the first Republican candidate, presidential candidate in 1856. Abraham Lincoln was the second one, who of course won the elections in 1860. And John C. Fremont immediately saw this and used it as a way to rally more support among American immigrants for the Republican Party. But he also wrote to Humboldt. And he said, in the history of your life and opinions, we find abundant reasons for believing that in the struggle in which friends to liberal progress in this country find themselves engaged, we have with us the strength of your name. And this is how, and Humboldt was aware of Fremont. He had actually asked the King of Prussia to give Fremont a medal for his pathfinding missions in the West. Now that's a little complicated because when it comes to Native Americans, Fremont does not have a very good record. But the fact remains that Humboldt becomes involved and he supports the candidacy of Fremont. When Fremont loses, he thinks of it as a great tragedy for the American Republic. But I think it's important for us to know how African Americans and abolitionists are viewing Humboldt. They clearly think that he is on their side of the question. They use his name repeatedly to say, in fact, somewhat naively, because they say things like, Frederick Douglass says, if you're a German, you're an abolitionist. If you're a German, you're anti-slavery, because his experience with German American immigrants, with German abolitionists, and with Humboldt had been such. I think I would like to also point out that at this point, one of Humboldt's students, Humboldt was his mentor, Louis Agassiz, had become a professor at Harvard University. And Agassiz was a great proponent of the pseudoscience of race. He argued for polygenesis, the fact that there were different origins to mankind, that there was permanent, immutable racial differences. He, in fact, issued photographs or commissioned photographs of enslaved people in the South, which Harvard University still has, these daguerreotypes, that reminds you a bit of Nazi racial science, because they try to categorize human beings physically as innately different. And one could blame Humboldt for Agassiz' opinions. I think not, because Humboldt actually repudiates Agassiz. And the German-American abolitionists take up the fight. They repudiate Agassiz and they say, your professor, your advisor, your doctor father, and maybe I don't think he actually directed his doctorate, repudiates your ideas. He believes in the unity of mankind. So I think it is really important for us to remember that even though von Humboldt may not have been an abolitionist. Abolitionists in the United States perceived him as such, and so did Southerners, because they started criticizing Humboldt at this time. In the slave South, they tried to take down his name, they tried to dispute his ideas, even dispute his findings, trying to discredit him. So whether Humboldt liked it or not, he became part of the debate over slavery and abolition, and abolitionists and African Americans saw them as his champion. And in a way, they quoted his ideas of the unity of mankind against the rise of the pseudoscience of race. And you can see Humboldt getting these ideas from many German philosophers and German Enlightenment thinkers like Herder. And I will end with Humboldt's words on the unity of humanity. He said, in maintaining the unity of the human race, we also reject the disagreeable assumption of superior and inferior peoples. Some people are more pliable, more highly educated, and ennobled by intellectual culture, but there are no races which are more noble than others. All are equally entitled to freedom which in the state of nature belongs to the individual, and which in civilization belongs as a right to the entire citizenry through political institutions. Thank you for listening so patiently. I will now hand over the floor to Lucius Lichte, and I guess we can begin with our conversation.
Yeah, I think we'll transition to a brief conversation between Manisha and Sandra about Humboldt before we'll enter the Q&A part of the event. Again, I encourage the audience to pose questions in the Q&A function. The questions that are already there will be addressed in the Q&A part of the event.
Yes. Thank you, Manisha. I have got a comment and a question for you. So the comment is, if you want to understand better Humboldt's approach to slavery, I think it's a good way to look at it as, well, for Humboldt, slavery was at the beginning, when he first encountered it in Spanish America, it was just one among the many evils of colonial society. So it's in this context that he came in contact with slavery. So he did not focus on slavery in particular, but he saw it in the context of how the indigenous were treated in the missions, the working conditions, in the mines, etc. So. And he, especially in his diaries, he spoke out, not in his conversations, or most likely not. Yeah, so we can't reconstruct it correctly, but it would not be his character. His way to work was to obtain all type of information and then process them. So this is what he did when he was in Cuba, when he was living at this farms, haciendas, and so he really this opened him a possibility. It opened him the possibility to also criticize slavery on, let's say, on not only on moral arguments, which are obvious, because he knew that he would not reach everybody with moral arguments, but it was also based on economic arguments. So he could show how certain work processes could be improved not using slaves. So this is something that he did, but then afterwards, and this is what he did in his work on Cuba. So of course, yes, he was when this was, especially the 7th chapter was taken out, he was furious, and in this context, he also said that when Thresher commented something like, oh, I thought that was not important. Then he responded saying, I give much more importance to any of those comments than any other statistical or economic data that I have provided in this book. So yes, I think it's important to see the evolution of Humboldt in this sense, also with regard to the United States, because at the beginning he was kind of, let's say, surprised or shocked that that slavery still persisted here in the US, because, as I said, it was part of a colonial system. But still, in a way, he wanted to see Jefferson in a position. As we know, Jefferson had both sides. Yeah, he did not get into action sufficiently with regard to the abolition of slavery. Yet he commented many things that are clearly against slavery. So he knew that something had to be done. And this is the facet of Jefferson that Humboldt wanted to see. So he wanted to see him as an ally in that cause. And especially over time, when he knew that, when he noticed that in the United States, it was not abolished, but in fact expanded, this is when he became more and more outspoken, up to a way that at the end of his life in Prussia, he instigated a law that was a Prussian law that was proclaimed that slavery was prohibited in Prussia. So of course there was no slavery, so it didn't need to be prohibited, but it was a sign for him to make clear wherever he could do something to do. I have a question for you, Manisha, but you also wanted to.
No, go ahead, ask the question first.
So the question is, the American abolitionists who used Humboldt, yeah, or who referred to him, who incorporated him into their discourse, in which way did they do it? Did they only refer to his name, like name dropping or making reference, or did they really incorporate his arguments? Let's say, for example, his arguments based on economics. So that is one question I have.
That's a good question. Well, first, let me just, your long comment on Humboldt's criticism of European colonialism in the Americas. You're right. I mean, he's not an abolitionist. His remarks on slavery, you could even see as throwaway, right? But they're there, and they're quite substantial, as you delineated. And his criticism of imperialism, I thought, is kind of interesting. And this is why I like that book, The Invention of Nature by Andrea Wolf, so much. Is that his criticism was, of course, the mistreatment of indigenous people, but also the abuse of the environment. I mean, he's seeing all of it in all its facets. This sort of having a monocrop, a staple culture, for the world market. Cotton, coffee, sugar, tobacco. He sees that all, both in South America and Cuba. And now, of course, this is very early on, and then he goes back to Germany and he doesn't come back, right? But he becomes famous for those books. At that point, that is when I come across him first, in the early 19th century, not when he actually takes a position in the politics in the United States, when the British abolitionists approach him and say, can you lend the prestige of your name to our movement against the slave trade? And I couldn't see any response from him. And I looked at other Humboldt scholars. I looked at Philip Foner, who has done the most intensive study of Humboldt's views on slavery and abolition, and I couldn't find that he actually responded to them. So clearly, at that point, he's not is not responding. His explorations, his voyages, are done with the permission of, the Spanish imperial order, the Spanish Empire. As you said, he needed that. But I really don't agree with this whole notion of the imperial gaze that somehow also included him. I think he had an independent scientific project that he conducted, and he was appalled by his few encounters, close encounters with slavery. But he also had a kind of a romanticized notion of the Spanish slave code. He calls it sometimes benevolent and all that. So he's clearly not a full-blown abolitionist. He's a man of the Enlightenment, uncomfortable with slavery. Unlike Jefferson, by the way, who, as a man of the Enlightenment, uncomfortable with slavery, but then used real racist ideas in his notes in the state of Virginia to justify the enslavement of people of African descent. Of course, he was a slaveholder himself, had a long-term relationship or abusive relationship with one of his enslaved women. So he's a complicated figure on those issues the way, probably Humboldt is not. But in the 1850s, his name is not just being evoked. All the quotations that I read out to you in English were abolitionists using Humboldt's words. And they did that. They were very discerning too. And it was not just the abolitionists, it was the German 1848ers who got into a dispute with Agassiz, because Agassiz was saying, hey, I'm Humboldt's student, and I believe that the races are unequal. And what the German-American socialist abolitionists are able to do is take this back to Humboldt and have him say the last word. So it's not just like evoking the name of a great man. They're actually evoking his ideas. And remember that the abolitionist critique of slavery was not just moral. It was political, it was ideological, it was economic. It was valuing what they call free labor versus slavery. It was valuing democracy versus all kinds of tyrannies. Humboldt, I think, sees that. He is part of that whole milieu of the age of revolution. He praises the Latin American republics. He hopes that the American Republic will abolish slavery. There are others like Thomas Paine. And when it comes to European figures, American abolitionists are looking particularly at Humboldt, but they also look at Mazzini, because Mazzini comes out and says, he's the Italian nationalist, and says, I think slavery is a really bad idea. And he gets into correspondence with abolitionists. They criticize other European nationalists like Lajos Kossuth, the Hungarian patriot who came to the United States and refused to say anything against slavery, and even tried to court slaveholders. Because he wanted help from the United States government to fight against the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So they're pretty well versed. And that's why when I looked at abolition, I looked at the American movement in a transnational context. Because they're aware of what the British are doing in India. They're aware of European imperialism. They're aware of certain European figures who have come out against slavery. And I think because Humboldt really allies himself, not so much with the abolitionists, but with the anti-slavery Republican Party. And I should say this, the law that he is instrumental in having passed in 1857 in Prussia is not an abolition law. It's what we call a free soil law. So it basically said that if you were an enslaved person and you landed in Prussia, you would be free, like the Somerset decision in Britain. Now, which slave from the Americas would land in Prussia? Maybe there were some instances, I haven't come across it. Maybe a historian of Prussia can look into this. But that 1857 law was a free soil law that said that the grounds of Prussia should not be polluted by the feet of a slave, or that slavery should be illegal. And Humboldt was the person behind that. So here's a man who's not just saying anti-slavery things. He's at that point towards the end of his life. This is, just before he dies, is willing to risk his reputation on this cause. And the way Southerners react to Humboldt is also interesting. Southern slaveholders who see him as this meddling foreigner, who try to take him down, because Humboldt, in a way, is what people call Marquis de Lafayette. He's the hero of two worlds by that time. He has this amazing outsized intellectual reputation. Whitman keeps his works when he's writing about nature. He inspires a lot of people. He's a great intellect. We forget that now. And so when he dies, the people who really commemorate him are the abolitionists. So I came across, when he dies in 1859, the Liberator, the most outspoken, the most radical abolitionist newspaper, has this sort of great tribute to Humboldt, because even though they recognize that he's kind of more of an anti-slavery free soiler, that's why I don't know how people can even think of him as a person who propounds manifest destiny, but they have an appreciation of him. They have a tribute to him. And it makes sense for them to appropriate Humboldt's name. It furthers their cause, and they know it. They do that with Mazzini too, and his letters on American slavery, and they do it with Humboldt too. Okay.
Okay, yeah.
So there is, I think we are running out of time, and maybe we should hand over the floor to Lucius here for questions from the audience.
I have one comment to that very briefly, and this is something that has happened to Humboldt all the time, that specific aspects, specific comments of him have been appropriated in different contexts. This is what I referred to at the beginning of my presentation, and this leads to contradictory interpretations of Humboldt. As I said, he's been taken as a colonial traveler, a colonial explorer, yet also as a leader of independence. And all these appropriations are done the same way. And this is that specific comments from him are taken out of the context and are incorporated in a different discourse. So this is what has happened, and the what Consulate General did with Humboldt's work on Cuba is just one more example, a very clear example, because normally when you do a translation of a brief, you can't just take out whatever you don't like or whatever does not like, whatever does not fit into your discourse. But that's what he did. Yeah, so in a way, let's take Humboldt, but let's take Humboldt in a way that we can use him, and whatever we think it's not, good for our course, we just take it out. And this is something, there's a problem that Humboldt faces in general. Okay, I wanted to be brief with the comments, so let's go maybe to the questions.
Yeah, thank you to the audience, first of all, to submitting questions. Please keep them coming. And yeah, I wanted to start off with maybe a question to you, Sandra, maybe Manisha, you also have some insights on this, but it's a question that looks at Humboldt and his beliefs. Like, why did Humboldt, as a white man, believe in the unity of races while he was still an outsider in the countries that he visited? And what about his personal background, his knowledge, caused him to have more morality than others of his time who owned slaves, for example?
So,
this is, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I will let you, Sandra, answer the personal question. You know more about his life and the early death of his father, etc., and his relationship with his brother and sister-in-law. But I would argue that this notion that somehow people at that time had no idea that slavery was wrong, including those of European descent, is simply incorrect. It's one of the reasons I wrote the big book. There were a lot of abolitionists then. The first wave of abolition comes out of the Enlightenment, comes out of the Age of Revolutions. It's in the late 18th century, and African Americans are not bystanders in this movement. They're part of it. So, Warner Mifflin, whom Herder writes about, is in contact with African Americans here. They're feeding into this movement. There are a lot of, white people of European descent at this point who really believe in the universal ideals of the Enlightenment, who believe in the unity of humankind. The notion that there are inherent differences by race, which is seen as somehow unchristian too, because it goes against the theory that we all descended from Adam, is something that abolitionists dispute. So it's not slaveholders. We tend to think about things in very simple ways, but we need to be more nuanced when we talk about people. It's not just white, the category. People saw themselves as Christian. Probably Humboldt didn't see himself as white. He saw himself probably as a Prussian, but they certainly saw themselves as European. And there is an insidious science of man that is being developed this time, with Blumenbach's different skulls and the grading of skulls, but later on with, Linnaeus's great chain of being, and the people just kept grading mankind. And the people who were doing the grading were Europeans, and they usually put themselves on top, and the rest of mankind in different groups, in subordinate groups. But I don't see that in Humboldt. He seems to really stick to that idea of the unity of humankind. He has, that one quote that he has a definite critique of the emergence of the pseudoscience of race in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, when African-American abolitionists start writing against this. One of them was James W.C. Pennington, a Black man, who was the first American to be given an honorary doctorate by the University of Heidelberg in 1849. And the reason why he was given the doctorate was because of his work with international peace, with pacifism, but also because he had taken on the pseudoscientists of race. So there are a lot of Black and white people, especially those associated with abolitionists, who are refuting rigid ideas of race being developed at that time in order to justify the enslavement of people of African descent.
Thank you. Sandra, maybe you could touch up on like Humboldt's personal history a little bit, his personal motivations. Thank you, Manisha, for contextualizing him in the greater situation.
I would say, he was an enlightened mind. It was his understanding of nature, of the human being in the nature of morality. That is also, it's very much based on the Enlightenment. And he himself said in several occasions he had like the ideas or the values of 1789, so the values of the French Revolution. So the values, not necessarily the outcome, so that's a difference. This is what he carries in his heart. And in Humboldt's case, it is not, let's say, a religious belief. It's not his, based on, let's say, Christian arguments, for example, because he was not a, I don't know if we can say, was not a believer. And let's say, religion did not play a role for him. And this is something that he, in fact, had been criticized several times. So if we look at Humboldt in general, not only with regard to slavery, but in general, I think it's very interesting to have a look at his formation, the education that he received, because he did not only study one field, he studied several fields. He was instructed by several mentors, professors, etc. So he got input from many different people, and he was like a sponge. So he absorbed all that. Yeah, that's why sometimes it's not the right approach because we tend to say, oh, Humboldt was the first to think this or to express this or whatever. No, sometimes he just continued ideas that other people had given him or things that he read. He continued them, he elaborated them, but then, he might have been the loudest voice to be heard. That's why we attribute it now to him. But yeah, as Manisha said, I mean, there were many people against slavery on both sides of the Atlantic, and definitely it must have been something different for Humboldt, being against slavery as a theoretical idea, but then being exposed to the situation. This is what happened in Cumaná when he arrived, what today is Venezuela, when he arrived there. And in his diaries, we can read that. Unfortunately, the diaries are only in German and French. Yeah? So it would be very good to have a translation, at least of some parts of it. Because this is really interesting where he describes it, and he describes how he was repelled by seeing even a slave market, because this is something, as I said, there's something different if you discuss about that in European salons, or if you see it in the New World, if you're a witness of that. So he was totally shocked there. But as we said, he tried to not to be too much outspoken while he was in America. And this is something that sometimes people criticize it, but I think we have to keep in mind that the authorization to travel through the Spanish colonies is something that could have been withdrawn in any moment. So he always had to fear that something could go wrong. He would, that authorization would be, there were certain moments when there was a change of power, for example, in Madrid. He was afraid of that could happen. And he also knew the examples of, let's say, less fortunate travelers, explorers that went back and then they were imprisoned, like, for example, Alejandro Malaspina. And the Malaspina, the participants of the Malaspina exploration voyage, they were among the people who instructed him when he was in Madrid preparing his expedition. So he was very well aware of that you have to be careful also. You cannot freely just say whatever you want while you're in the situation. Later, you can be outspoken, and you can find different tools to do that, and that's what he did. In many ways, as I said, not only slavers, but in many ways with the colonial societies, but not only colonial. I mean, colonial was Spain, and look at the situation that he encountered in his expeditions through Russia. So this was really an expedition that was much more restricted, and Humboldt complained about that. So he knew he had, they were accompanied by people that were watching every step they did. So compared to that, he was really free in the Spanish possessions. He was free to travel wherever he wanted, to do whatever he wanted. He didn't have any instruction. The only, let's say, instruction, or the only favor that the Spanish crown had asked for is that he sent collections, mineral collection, botanical collections to the most eminent scientific institutions in Madrid. But besides that, he was absolutely free in this case.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, with respect to time, I'll try to maybe pose two more questions. One of them is drawing a little bit on where we are geographically right now, so Humboldt's relationship with the United States. So the question is, in essence, was Humboldt unwittingly brought into commenting on American politics by other individuals, such as the man who deceptively translated Humboldt's work, for example, on Cuban slavery, or even by radical German Americans, 1848ers, as you mentioned. Do you think he would have ever voiced his support directly for, or did he ever voice his support directly for the anti-slavery movement in the United States?
That's a really good question. So I don't think Humboldt is just being manipulated and used and appropriated by people, because he's actually intervening, right? He's the one who makes sure that Fremont gets that medal from the King of Prussia. He's the one who deplores the Mexican War as a land grab for slavery, as does Abraham Lincoln, by the way. So he's commenting on political developments in the New World, but not as an abolitionist activist, which he wasn't, but as a person who deplores slavery, as as that reputation that he had built up for himself as a European enlightened thinker and as a scientist. In fact, the term that he uses is interesting. He calls the attempt to get Mexico savage, right? So what Herder did, reversing the symbolism of civilization and savagery in a way. So it's very nice, just like throwaway comments. How he gets involved is, in fact, when his work is, and he uses, I don't know what the German is, but the phrase that I came across increasingly was mutilated, that his work was mutilated by this pro-slavery Southerner, and that he then responds to that and says he does not want his work censored. So he is intervening directly. In terms of direct relationships, I did not come across any sort of direct connections as such between Humboldt and prominent abolitionists. The only connection was there when Agassiz tries to use his name. Agassiz even says that Humboldt is very religious, and the German radical socialists, abolitionists say, no, he's not at all religious. So they even fight about that. So there is that conversation going on between Agassiz, his former student, and these German American abolitionists. But the people whom he's directly in contact with are people like Fremont, whom he corresponds with. Fremont writes a letter to him. He writes back to him, he openly supports the Republican Party. When Fremont loses, he makes, today you would call it like a public statement, that how bad it is that a person like Buchanan, pro-slavery Democrat, in virtually the hands of Southern slaveholders, has won the presidency. Now, Humboldt is not a politician as such. I think he does try to navigate, between these sort of political paths, and the King of Prussia wants him back in Prussia. He would rather be in France. So, he's navigating in all this stuff. He's not, but he's not an 1848er. He was not part of the, the radicals who tried to create a German republic then. So he's not a great, so for him to have actually gotten into this controversy, whether it was through the thing of his work or not, but I do think it was there earlier with the Mexican War, his remarks there, is interesting to me. And it shows that it is not just a throwaway remark on slavery, that he's actually taking a position on American politics.
Sandra, I saw you nodding there quite a bit. I assume you share similar thoughts.
Yeah, because the topic, Humboldt's navigation between science and politics, I mean, this is a topic that has occupied me during years. I wrote a book on that because this is what I found interesting. He was not only a naturalist, so we should not only see him as someone being interested in plants or minerals or measuring temperature or whatever. His interest was much broader than that. So he was also interested in any topic related to trade, commerce, politics, statistics. So here we get into a field that is connected to, let's say, to the power, that can be the colonial power, it can also be a different form of power, let's say the political power in general, not only in a colonial context. So of course, generating this kind of information, you are in context with the power. Humboldt knew that, and in many occasions he also used that. He was consulted as an expert on Spanish America and later on Latin America. Of course, he was contacted. His opinion was asked, and he gave his opinion. And his opinion was always based on his moral reflections. So he was concerned not only about plants, he was concerned about people. And if he saw a way where how he could contribute to improve a situation, then he would do that using his tools and using his good contacts. So this is something that we need to keep in mind from the beginning. But of course, also here we can see a development over time, because later in his later years, especially when he returned to Prussia, when he had to return because he was claimed by the Prussian king, he took more also a role as a science manager. So he was an advisor to the king. An advisor, he was sent, already in early years, but especially when he returned to Prussia, he took more and more a position where he was a kind of, let's say, unofficial diplomat. He was sent to diplomatic missions by the Prussian king. So of course he got more and more involved in this world over his time, and it was a way for him also to connect both, to connect the world of science and the world of politics. For example, this is where we get into the field of science diplomacy, where he used his good connection to the political world to further science or scientific projects.
Thank you. Yeah, and maybe as our last question, I'd like to kind of bring it back to the present time, bring Humboldt back to our time. And I mean, we're at a virtual event at a university. So I'd like to ask, and maybe a brief closing statement from both of you. With that in mind, like, are Humboldt's books and his work and his writings, are they currently being taught in schools in Germany, Europe, the United States? His positions on slavery and the abuse of indigenous people, are they widely known? And why is that, perhaps, or why is it not?
So I think over the last years, and maybe with the help also of the Humboldt commemorations in 2019, when we celebrated the 250th anniversary, I think a lot of attention was drawn to Humboldt, and this also led to publications, to new editions of his work, etc. And this is very important, the new edition of his work, so that people can read him in different languages. So a lot of things has been done, and I think that is very positive. Yet what I observe, and maybe even more over the last years, is what I said at the beginning, is misinterpretations of Humboldt, where he is being torn into different debates or seen from different angles, where that do not do justice to him. when yeah, I mean, I've been told things that are totally untrue in different places from different angles. Like, for example, the fact that he passed information to Thomas Jefferson is something that has been criticized a lot. But, and you can criticize if you want to, but then base your criticism on facts, yeah, and not wrong interpretation. For example, I was told he sold the information. Or I was told this is why later the United States could invade Mexico and could take large portions of the land. So all that is not true. What I'm trying to say is it's wonderful to re-edit his work, but I think it is important, and that is the reason why I was excited about this idea. It is important to contextualize him well, to give some tools to help people to understand better. For example, why some people even connect him with with German colonial pursuits that started much later. Others, yeah, connect him to so many different things, and there I think it's important to clarify because we can. I mean, it's first of all, I think we should not or especially as historians, I think our work should not be, or our mission to basically judge, should primarily judge historical persons, but to understand them and maybe help the society to understand them better. Because if we understand them better, then we can draw lessons. And also, I think that instead of only this is my closing remark. Instead of only looking at historical persons and seeing where they failed to address the evils of their time, we should look at, let's say, the problems of our time and see how we can solve them. And drawing the connection to slavery, I mean, forms of slavery still persist in different ways, but still persist. So this is something that I would like to use as a final thought.
Okay, so I would just use my closing remarks to address some of the questions that came by and we didn't have a chance to address. You know, how do we remember Humboldt today? We know that, you know, the Smithsonian, one of your audience members remarked, had a very good exhibition on Humboldt and had some wonderful essays in the Smithsonian magazine on Humboldt, which I would recommend that your readers look at. I think the problem has been that, you know, Humboldt was a man of many parts. I mean, as I said, he's like one of the last Renaissance men who did a lot of things. And in our days of scientific inquiry, when we are so specialized and so narrow that, you know, maybe except for historians and Humboldt scholars like Sandra, you know, we don't perhaps give him enough due. I really think we do need to perhaps look back, and, you know, I'm a 19th century historian, so I like reading people from that time. And I like reading all his words in translation. I really loved the biography, The Invention of Nature by Andrea Wolf, that I will recommend again. You know, so I think it's important for us, in fact, to recall those figures, because we have a very flat history and very simplistic histories where something has to be all of this or all of that. I'm thinking of Mary Louise Pratt's Imperialize and her discussion of Humboldt, which was, you know, as a historian of slavery and of racism, of abolition, I didn't find that convincing at all, you know, having read other material on him. So I think it's important not to do the either or things and really understand the figure. And when we as historians look at, you know, the contributions of Humboldt, he has so much to say to us. Today, we think of the refugee problem in Europe that Germany in particular experienced in the last decade or so. There are ways to look back into German history. You know, when I talked about Herder or Heine, people were like, oh, did they really say anything against slavery? We didn't know that they were writing poetry, and they were. You know, and I look at the way African Americans were received in Germany. And again, it's a little romanticized. Many African Americans, having experienced enslavement and bitter racism in this country, found their reception there, you know, very heartening. And I'll just close by saying the great Black writer, activist, thinker, W.E.B. Du Bois was given an honorary doctorate from Humboldt University in Berlin. And I think there's something kind of appropriate about that. So for me, it became very interesting to see when Humboldt chose to intervene on this issue. This is not something that people are making of him. He actually participated in it and became part of this forgotten political controversy in the United States in the 1850s. I think we can learn a lot, both in the US and Germany, by resurrecting him in all his complexity, as Sandra has put it.
Thank you. Thank you both for your inspiring conversation. Thank you both for your contributions. I would also like to thank the audience and apologize that we couldn't get to every single question. Thank you to UConn for helping us put this event together, and I hope you all enjoy your afternoon. And thank you for joining us today.